Recording now. All right, we are recording. So, yeah, thank you so much for joining me today. You're someone that we've been really interested in just getting to speak with. And so I was wondering if we could start out just by, you giving us an introduction as to who you are and what work you do.
Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for having me here. My name is Rey Valmores-Salinas. I am a transgender woman. Currently, I'm the spokesperson of Bahaghari, which is a grassroots organization of the LGBTQ plus here in the Philippines. So Bahaghari means rainbow, right? So that's where our name comes from. And what we do usually is definitely we lobby and we fight for legislation for the LGBTQ plus. But beyond that, we reach out to communities, for example, urban poor communities. Um, we try to link with other organizations such as workers' organizations. We stand with, we essentially have a comprehensive outlook on LGBTQ plus activism. And we think that the struggles of society at large are also the struggles of the LGBTQ plus. I'm also currently a member of the board of directors at the Center for Women's Resources, which is a non-stock, non-profit research institution for Filipino women.
Wow, that's a lot of work, huh? So do you think that you could, tell us like what is your path to becoming an organizer?
All right. So I never envisioned being an organizer. When I was young, my dream was really to work to cancer. That's why my degree when I was in college, it was molecular biology and biotechnology. And about halfway through, when I was doing my thesis and I was in my senior year, I just kind of realized, okay, even if I do discover something, who is this going to benefit? Like the people who do not have any access to healthcare probably wouldn't even be able to benefit from this. And then I also started to see the barriers that women like me face, even in science that's supposedly a quote unquote objective field. So I began to see how there are women like me losing their opportunities because of who they are, because of their gender identity. Um, and so that really led me down the path of activism. And that's how I found Bahaghari. Um, at first, it was really just, I wanted to be able to fight in my own way. That was kind of my mentality before. While I was working in the lab. Um, but then the more that I got involved, I got to see the need for people to actually be dedicated towards organizing members of our community. So that's when I decided to be a full-time organizer for Bahaghari.
Definitely. And, as I'm sure you're aware, recently news came out about Duterte increasing aggression, towards the left and specifically saying to kill them all regarding the communists. So, what does Duterte's aggression towards communists mean for LGBT people, but also for organizers or activists in general in the Philippines?
Yeah, just 2 days ago, we saw probably one of the most gruesome attacks on the right to dissent. This came right after what you said when Duterte mentioned kill them all in response to the so-called communists. The Philippines is different. First of all, the Philippines is different from, say, the US, and that in the US you can just say you're a communist, you believe in this and that, you're a Marxist, etc. In the Philippines, if a person is called a communist, they get killed. So that's how we have, this whole idea of red tagging. It has actual consequences of violence and state terror. Um, and we have to remember that the president's pronouncements are not just mere words, they're not just mere jokes. The same goes with his misogynist and homophobic jokes. They're not just random words in the air. They have actual consequences. They empower, for example, state forces to commit atrocities. What happened yesterday when there were, I believe, 9 activists were arrested and 6 who were murdered in their own homes. That was a direct consequence of Duterte actually empowering police officers and saying, you can do this and you will not be harmed if you do so. And it's really reminiscent of like the McCarthyite Red Scare that the US had. And it has consequences at large for activists. Obviously, we see it, but it also has consequences for the LGBTQ. For example, just a few days ago, there was a barangay captain. I'm actually not sure about their gender identity, so I'll just use they, them. Their name is Julie. They were a barangay captain in Roosevelt. The barangay name is Roosevelt, so you can think of it like a county or something. Last year in December, there was a massacre of the Tumandok. The Tumandok are indigenous people here in the Philippines. There was a massacre of their leaders. And then what happened was a few days later, the intelligence arm of our state forces, Julie was able to discover that they were actually planting evidence against the Tumandok leaders who were murdered. So they wanted to make it seem like they were members of the NPA, so therefore their murders were justified. Julie exposed this. They took photos of the police forces literally planting guns and bombs in the homes of the leaders who were murdered. Julie exposed this, and afterwards, Julie was summoned to the military bases near the area. They were given death threats. And then soon after, just a few weeks ago, Julie was killed. And so this Red Scare, this extreme and violent attack towards the left in general and towards people in general who critique the administration has effects towards the LGBTQ plus, just like Julie.
Have you ever been in fear of your life for being red tagged?
Absolutely. It's a daily fear. Whenever I so much as post something criticizing Duterte online, there's bound to be dozens of trolls, government-funded troll farms that flood your posts and your tweets. And there's a very real threat of actual harm happening to you. What's really disheartening is that we live in a time when we say, ingat ka or be careful. It's actually something that's very heavy. Like, you know how people say, or you say, okay, I'm going somewhere, and the person says, be careful. Like, it's just, okay. But now, if you say, be careful, like, there's weight to it. Because if you go out, maybe someone is going to put you into a van. You'll never be received us. That's a reality for organizations on the ground, just like Bahaghari. And for example, people who are visible, speaking out in rallies, they are vulnerable. So that's also the kind of role that I have as a spokesperson. So there's always that fear when people red tag you online, when people say, you're a member of the CPP, NPA, you know, the fear is real, the threat is real.
So, we have some people here in the US that say most people in the Philippines support Duterte, or, the MPA, they're terrorists. And the people using drugs, they're not poor people, the ones that are being killed by the extrajudicial killings. How would you respond to that?
All right, so I'll respond first to the claim that Filipinos support Duterte. Maybe it seems like it because of the artificial support that the regime gets through its troll farms. When you see dozens and dozens of trolls saying, "We love Duterte, we want Sara Duterte to run," right? It gives the illusion of people actually wanting Duterte. But if you go to the actual communities, to the urban poor, if you join the workers who are struggling right now, 45% of the workforce has lost their jobs because of the pandemic. Um, if you go to and speak with farmers, none of them want Duterte to be there. The people who are actually bearing the brunt of the suffering because of the economic crisis resulting from the failed pandemic response of Duterte, none of them want Duterte to be there. It's more accurate. It's more accurate to say that people are too afraid to speak out rather than people are wanting Duterte to be there. And actually that's what's lacking. A lot of people feel that, okay, they hate Duterte, but also they feel disempowered. They feel like they can't do anything. And that's what we're trying to change now, by actually reaching out to the communities. Even if there's a pandemic, that's no reason for people to be silent. Um, Sorry, what is the second
Yeah,
claim that?
the second thing that these people would say is that the people Duterte are killing, that one, the NPA is all terrorists, and two, the victims of the extrajudicial killings are not poor people, that they are, maybe using hard drugs like meth, and they're not really poor people being killed, and that most people support these extrajudicial killings.
All right. So first of all, the statement that the New People's Army or the NPA, that they're terrorists. I think the very basic question we need to be asking. No, let's be honest. There is a civil war going on in the Philippines between the government of the Republic of the Philippines and the New People's Army. Between the two, I think it's easy to question which ones slaughter the people who speak out, which ones on the daily harass, rape, molest, vilify, and abuse women, especially in the countryside. It's easy to answer which one among the two actually stands for the ruling class explicitly, not just for the ruling classes here in the Philippines, but the imperialists. Um, and none of that applies to the New People's Army. Um, in fact, if you have a conversation with farmers who have been to the countryside, there's this really big story before about how there was a middle class person from the cities. He was talking with a farmer who came from the countryside, and the farmer said, do you guys have NPAs where you are? And the middle class dude was like, no, we don't have NPAs in the city. And so the response of the farmer was like, what? You don't have NPAs there? Then who protects you from the landlords? So like that kind of gives you the idea of which side, for example, the New People's Army is actually fighting for, and which side state forces are fighting for. So I, for one, believe that the NPA is an expression of people who have been for so long denied of social justice that they feel there is no longer any alternative but to take up arms. And so that is not terrorism to me. In fact, that is the sovereign right of the people to seek redress from a government that has failed them. So that's what I think on the matter. When it comes to how or the claim that it's not poor people that are being killed by the war on drugs, so that's flat out wrong. There have been around 30,000 extrajudicial killings under Duterte in the supposed war on drugs. And the vast majority of them come from the urban poor. Among all the organizations that Bahaghari is aligned with, it was actually, if I'm not mistaken, organizations in the urban poor who were the very first to call for an ouster for Duterte because they see firsthand how their communities are impacted by the war on drugs. Um, we have seen, for example, how there have been drug lords, like the actual kingpins of the operations. They have been exposed, but none of them are being killed in the so-called war on drugs. It's always the poorest people who, because of the lack of opportunities and jobs, they end up pushing drugs in the streets, right? It's always they who get murdered. And so it's actually not true that it's not for people being killed. The war on drugs is, in fact, a war against the poor because it is the poor people who are being killed, while the biggest violators of this supposed war are the ones who get away with it.
Yeah, thank you for correcting that because I think there's a ton of misinformation here in the US, even among the left. And so, hearing you set the line straight is extremely helpful. Um, so I want to sort of move directions a little bit. We were sort of talking among our editorial team about how the first same sex marriage was actually performed in the Philippines by the NPA. Do you think that you could give us a little background on the struggle for LGBT rights, including same sex marriage and, uh, you know, where we're at right now in terms of the condition for LGBT people in the Philippines?
Right. So when it comes to the LGBTQ plus struggle, just like any other struggle, even before there came to be organized members of the LGBTQ, we see the exploitation happening. So there have been lots of spontaneous expressions of resistance. Um, for example, I'm not so sure about the date. I think it's 1992. It was in the Women's March. There was like a collective. They call themselves the Lesbian Collective. So like they group themselves together. So that was definitely um, one of the watershed moments. Um, and you're right. It was actually in the revolutionary government of the NPA that the first same-sex marriage happened. Up until now, there is still no same-sex marriage, or rather marriage equality, in the government of the Republic of the Philippines. Even the barest minimum anti-discrimination laws have been languishing in Congress for 20 years. And so that kind of also makes you think, if you're an LGBTQ plus advocate, do you think working with the system is the best way to to fight for equality when we have seen, for example, the New People's Army, um, or the revolutionary government in general? If I'm not mistaken, it's ratified marriage equality as early as 1992. There has been a recorded case of same-sex marriage in 1995. Although there are more sources that could support the marriage happening in 2005. But either way, we are definitely backward when it comes to LGBTQ plus rights, when it comes to marriage equality, when it comes to even the barest recognition of our humanity through a law that protects us against discrimination. Um, Even the words gay or lesbian, they're never mentioned in any law in the Philippines, except perhaps in the Safe Spaces Act, which is like prohibition of um, acts of abuse in like public spaces, if I'm not mistaken. Um, but yeah, in short, the LGBTQ plus are invisible. We are not considered, our struggles are not considered real struggles by the government. Our struggles always take a backseat. That's where we are right now. But definitely, that doesn't mean that we are not going to struggle and we're not going to fight for our rights.
Definitely. And so, what would you say is necessary to advance LGBT rights in the Philippines, and in general?
Okay. Um, I think that for the LGBTQ plus to attain genuine equality, um, this is something that could never happen with um, the kind of society we have in the Philippines, with the kind of relations of production that we have. Um, sorry, I'm trying to find a way to explain this in the best way possible in a short manner. But um, essentially, in a feudal society, that's where the gender binary is most strengthened when you look at the evolution of a society. And because the Philippines lacks its own national industries, we've been stuck in sort of a limbo. We are not exactly feudal, but also, are we really capitalist if we don't have our own industries? If the few factories that are here are owned by foreign corporations, right? So that has consequences with the kind of culture that we have, especially when it comes to women and the LGBTQ plus. You know, so for what I'm trying to say is, in order for the LGBTQ plus to be liberated, for every single member of the LGBTQ plus to be liberated, not just the middle class, not just the classes above it, we need to escape the kind of social economic system that we have. And essentially, in one sentence, that means LGBTQ plus liberation entails socialism. Um, that's really what I wanted to say. You know, we need to find a way to escape the pitfall of identity politics that is really a huge trap for so many movements, for example, the women's movement, and turn towards a more proletarian orientation that actually addresses the roots of the gender struggle, which is the class struggle. So I think that is what is entailed for us to be able to have actual emancipation for our community.
Yeah, and so on that lines, as I'm sure you know, in recent years, this idea of intersectionality has become so popular as a sort of tool or pathway to advancing the rights of marginalized people. What do you think of this concept of intersectionality?
Um, I personally wouldn't be maligning people who say they're intersectional feminists, etc. There's a point towards recognizing that our struggles are all interlinked. But I also feel that there are actually very real limitations to intersectionality as like a theory. For example, intersectionality assumes that we have all these different facets of us that are discrete. For example, our gender, our race, our class, our disability status, etc. They are all discrete entities and they just happen to intersect at some points. Um, that kind of lends itself to the assumption that when you say gender, when you say gender exploitation or gender oppression, that is equal to class oppression, that is equal to racial oppression, that is equal to your oppression based on your disability status. And so that kind of actually distracts from the class struggle at large. Like if you visualize intersectionality, it's sort of like a huge Venn diagram. You have gender, you have class, you have race, etc. But the way I see it, all these forms and facets of exploitation, like your race, your gender, they're actually held together by your class, right? Like, um, essentially, what I'm trying to say is there's the false equivalence of all these forms of oppression that arises through intersectionality. That is why, for example, in Bahaghari, we prefer to say that our struggle is comprehensive. We fight alongside farmers, we fight alongside workers, instead of saying that we're intersectional.
Yeah, such a like concise response that you gave. So thank you for that. So, one of the things that we've been looking at is how, imperialism and colonialism impacts trans and LGBT identity in neo-colonies or in the, imperial periphery. How would you say imperialism and colonialism impacts uh, LGBT identity and community in the Philippines?
All right. So before there was actually a Philippines as a political entity, it was a group, a very diverse group of several tribes, several kingdoms, different stages of development as different societies. And if you actually look at the evolution of societies, as I mentioned earlier, it's in feudalism. Feudalism is the stage when gender roles are exacerbated to the greatest extent. So, in the areas in the Philippines, by the way, it's not the Philippines yet. There have been areas where, for example, trans women, what we call trans women in today's articulation, um, they were people who held religious power and therefore political power. Um, a lot of times they were called the Babaylan, they were called the Catalonan, the Asog. It's very roughly translated to shaman. But their view before was that um, womanhood was associated with life. And so how they viewed womanhood was actually very different from the way we viewed it. We view it now, which is like tied to your genitals. Before, there have been groups where even whatever genitals you have, you get to choose whether you are a woman in society, and therefore whether you get to become a babaylan or a Catalona and hold political power. So it's actually kind of interesting to see how in ages past, people like us who are being slaughtered on the daily now are the people who hold prestige in society. And when the Spanish came, they wanted to turn the Philippines into a feudal country as a whole. First of all, they declared it's the Philippines, and then enforced feudalism through um, the name escapes me, but they kind of separated the barangays into separate entities under the control of Spanish officials or Spanish friars. They were called encomiendas. There we go. Um, and through that, feudalism was actually strengthened. That's how we came to see a gender binary here in the Philippines. And before, when they were still trying to conquer the Philippines, their tactic was to convert people. And so if you actually think in 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 the mind of a Spanish conqueror, if you're trying to do this with religion, if you're trying to conquer people through religion, the first step you do is to depower the religious leaders, which happen to be the transgender women in our present articulation. So it was actually the Babaylan that were first to be slaughtered. There have been reports of them being chopped up and fed to the crocodiles. So they were also the first ones who fled to the mountains. They were the first one to take up arms against the colonizers. And so they got called bayot, which at the time meant coward. But now bayot is the word that's used in Bisaya to refer to a person who's gay. So, you see how colonization is actually what led to the very backward culture that we have right now. Now, fast forward to imperialism, the age of imperialism, you know, um, in particular, we have rich experiences with the US. In around 1980 to 1999, there have been like 3,000 cases of US soldiers committing acts of violence against women and children. And in 2014, one of our transgender sisters, Jennifer Laude, was brutally murdered by a US soldier, Joseph Scott Pemberton. Just last year, Pemberton was given an absolute pardon. So he was freed. Now he's walking amongst everyone else in the US. as if nothing happened. But what that really says, imperialism has impacted us in such a way that we are secondary citizens in our own country, especially the LGBTQ plus like Jennifer Laude. Our lives are just dispensable, more so when they are placed in comparison with the US soldiers who are here in our shores, right? So that is actually how colonialism and imperialism, have impacted us as a community.
Yeah, that's horrible that, he got pardoned. I remember when that decision and that news came out. Um, so, on the sort of topic of, trans women, um, as you know, it's sort of a global problem that so many of us, especially if we are proletarian or if we are nationally oppressed, that we are, really forced into the sex trade in order to survive. But at the same time, we're also sort of stigmatized and looked down upon. So, how would you say that we can fight the forced sexual exploitation of trans women without increasing the stigma around us?
All right. So first of all, we have to come to terms with the fact that yes, there are some trans people, and cis people in general, cisgender women, who have the quote unquote choice to, or the financial capacity to say, okay, I want to enter the sex trade and then I can leave it when I want. But the vast majority of us are people who have been so disenfranchised, losing every opportunity possible, such that we get forced into the sex trade. That's what we have to establish first. You know, um, and we think that that is not the fault of women. That is not the fault of transgender women, that they have been denied so much that they get forced into the sex trade. So we view it as, or we believe that the people who enter the sex trade should be decriminalized. But what we should be criminalizing are the pimps and the people who drive the prolonged existence of the sex trade in the first place. Essentially, targeting the demand side of things, right? And alongside that, fighting and creating opportunities so that women and the LGBTQ plus are not forced into the sex trade. That's how we view it.
Yeah, and I just wanted to sort of personally thank you for stating that. Both myself and so many of my other trans sisters, we all shared that experience of being forced into the sex trade, and even when we wanted to leave, not being able to. And so, just want to say I appreciate your clarity in articulating that. Um,
Yeah, I mean, yeah, can I just comment really quickly? I also, at one point when I came out to my family and then I was like shunned, I was nearly forced into the sex trade. And so I actually understand, maybe not fully because I was not actually fully forced into it. Eventually, I found a home and people to accept me. But, you know, um, it disgusts me when the conversation ends with, this is my choice, this is my decision, and the conversation just ends there. We never discuss how we have a society around us that is actively forcing so many members of our community into this. This goes beyond ourselves individually. This is a conversation about systems. This is a conversation about how, en masse, we are being exploited to such an extent that we have no other choice but to enter this trade. And so we cannot just end the conversation with, I personally have the choice, please respect me. It does not end there. And there's a whole other conversation about how, for example, legalizing the sex trade has consequences when it comes to sex trafficking. Um, People have been denying that relation, but there are studies that support that. So I just feel like um, that position needs to be made clear. We're not people who are against sex workers. We are not trying to form stigma for people who are forced into that. But we also need to acknowledge, that we could be doing so much more than just accepting the system as it is, which is patriarchal and viewing us as mere objects.
100% to that. We can't accept that end of history narrative, huh? That capitalism is the end of history and this is the best we're gonna get, right?
Right.
So you know, what what would your advice be to not just to trans women and LGBT people, but to workers and oppressed people in general who maybe hear your story and what you have to say and say, I want to organize, but there is no, organization I'm a part of. So what can I do?
All right. So first of all, there's actually no singular formula to becoming a good organizer, quote unquote. You need to be able to adjust depending on the situation you're in, depending on the society you're in, depending on the people you're organizing. And I think that in particular with the LGBTQ plus, um, we need to have a very real conversation about how identity politics has blinded us into thinking that sisterhood is global. Like, just because this person is trans, therefore we're sisters. Just because this person is a woman, we're sisters. Never mind the fact that she's bombing countries in the global south. You know, um, essentially what I'm trying to say is we need to and go beyond the confines of just seeing um, identity as it is and it ends there. And it goes back to the principles that we espouse as an organization. For the LGBTQ plus to be liberated, all sectors of society should be liberated. And in fact, the LGBTQ plus is not a class. It's a sector that cuts across classes. So we are also workers. We're also farmers. We're also migrants. We're also people who are in part of indigenous groups. So for every member of our community to be liberated, we need to take part in each of these sectors' struggles. And in fact, we don't have to view things as, discrete, like there's a separate struggle for the LGBT that's divorced from the struggles of farmers. We are being exploited by the same system. And so I think one of the biggest takeaways and one of the things I had to learn, and one of the realizations I had to be where I am now is that there is a very real need for us to link arms with every other oppressed sector and actually form, a broad unity that will be able to, that will allow us to escape the system that we're in. So that is the biggest advice I would give for any budding LGBTQ plus organizer.
Definitely. And the last question that I have for you is, your struggle as workers, as peasants, in the Philippines. I mean, you have inspired a spirit of proletarian internationalism all over the world. I've seen people all across the US, in Ireland, in Latin America, Canada, everywhere, posting in solidarity with your struggle. Um, but a lot of times people maybe don't know what they can do to support your struggle. So, what can we do for those of us who are outside of the Philippines but are inspired by you and want to stand in solidarity with you?
All right. So I have this view where, people like us that are in the Philippines and the neo colonies, the semi colonies, and the actual colonies, right? Um, Definitely, we are facing right in front of us the violence of imperialism, and so we resist it. But I also feel like the proletarians in the imperialist countries have a big role when it comes to putting an end to imperialism. You know, for example, organizations in the US, concrete things that um, they can do are to demand an end to the endless and meaningless wars for profit abroad. Even things as simple as demanding healthcare instead of wars, um, healthcare for people instead of purchasing more weapons of war. That in itself is a blow to imperialist wars of aggression. And that also contributes to the larger proletarian struggle around the world for everyone's liberation. So it doesn't mean that we're the only ones who are able to resist imperialism because we're here, we're facing it. Even the very citizens of the imperialist countries have a big role in putting an end to it. And that's how I view international solidarity. We all have a role to play when it comes to changing the system in the global world order of capitalism towards a better form of system that would actually lead to liberation for women, the LGBTQ, and every member of society.
Definitely. Well, I just wanted to express my gratitude for you. You make me feel like I want to go out and organize and, push the proletarian movement forward. And so, thank you for everything that you do. You have friends here, and if you ever need anything, you can always ask, and we'll be here. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. And, it also, in the same way, it makes me realize that this movement is definitely something that is alive and everywhere. Whether you're here, whether you're in the US, there are people who share the same values, people who share the same goals, and that kind of reignites my passion as well, into fighting for this for all of us. So thank you so much.